The fluorescent lights of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport flickered erratically as Marcus Williams watched the last passenger board Flight 447 to Denver. The 36-year-old security chief adjusted his earpiece, the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders like a well-worn coat. 20 years of dedicated service had taught him to read the subtle signs of trouble, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold in Terminal C. The first scream cut through the ambient noise of rolling luggage and departure announcements at exactly 2:47 p.m. Marcus's head snapped toward the sound, his trained eyes immediately scanning the crowd for the source of distress. What he saw made his blood run cold. A middle-aged white woman, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer handbag clutched to her chest, was pointing directly at him, her face contorted with what appeared to be genuine terror. "That man!" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the terminal with startling clarity. "He's coordinating with terrorists. I saw him on his radio, giving them our security codes." The bustling terminal fell silent, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Marcus, who stood frozen in disbelief. The woman, who would later be identified as Karen Mitchell from suburban Roswell, continued her performance with the dedication of a seasoned actress. "I heard him speaking Arabic into that device," she declared, pointing at Marcus's standard-issue security radio. "He was telling someone about the flight schedules, about when the planes would be most vulnerable." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. In his 2 decades of service, he had never encountered anything remotely resembling this moment. The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke, and he could feel the collective gaze of every person in the terminal boring into him. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "I'm the chief of security here. I was coordinating with ground crews about standard departure procedures." But Karen Mitchell was already dialing 911, her manicured fingers stabbing at the numbers with theatrical urgency. "I need federal agents immediately," she announced into the phone, her voice pitched to carry across the terminal. "There's a terrorist operative at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, and he's about to execute an attack." The transformation that followed was immediate and devastating. Within minutes, the terminal erupted into controlled pandemonium as armed federal agents stormed through the concourses. The sound of heavy boots on polished floors echoed like gunshots, and passengers began screaming as they dove for cover behind check-in counters and baggage carousels. Marcus found himself surrounded by 6 armed agents, their weapons drawn and their faces hidden behind tactical masks. The lead agent, a stern-faced woman with steely gray eyes, approached him with the measured steps of someone accustomed to life-or-death situations. "Marcus Williams," she barked, her voice muffled by her mask, but still carrying unmistakable authority. "Yes, that's me," Marcus replied, slowly raising his hands to show he posed no threat. "I'm the security chief here. There's been a terrible mistake." "Sir, you're being detained on suspicion of providing material support to terrorist organizations," the agent announced, her words echoing through the now silent terminal. "You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists, Karen Mitchell stood at the edge of the crowd, her phone held high to record the arrest. The satisfied smirk on her lips was barely concealed behind a mask of concerned citizenship. She had no way of knowing that her actions would trigger a cascade of events that would shut down the entire national aviation system and strand millions of passengers across the country. The arrest of Marcus Williams sent shockwaves through the Department of Homeland Security's threat assessment protocols. Within 30 minutes of Karen's call, emergency alerts were cascading through every major airport in the United States. The assumption was simple and terrifying if a security chief at one of the nation's busiest airports could be compromised. Then, the entire system was potentially vulnerable. At Los Angeles International Airport, passengers watched in bewilderment as armed security teams began herding them away from departure gates. The voice over the intercom was calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a credible security threat, all departing flights have been temporarily suspended. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of security personnel." Similar scenes played out simultaneously at Chicago O'Hare, where a businessman named David Chen was literally pulled from his seat on a Boeing 777 just as it was pushing back from the gate. "What's happening?" he demanded. But the flight attendants could only shake their heads in confusion. They knew as little as the passengers about the nationwide emergency that was unfolding. In New York's LaGuardia Airport, the situation quickly deteriorated from confusion to chaos. Thousands of stranded passengers, many of whom had been traveling for business or family emergencies, found themselves trapped in a surreal nightmare. The terminals, designed for constant movement and flow, became pressure cookers of human frustration and fear. Sarah Rodriguez, a nurse from Phoenix who had been trying to reach her dying mother in Miami, collapsed in tears near Gate B7. She might not make it through the night. She sobbed to anyone who would listen. "I need to be there. I need to hold her hand one more time." The ripple effects extended far beyond the airports themselves. At the Federal Aviation Administration's command center in Herndon, Virginia, controllers stared at screens that showed the entire national airspace grinding to an unprecedented halt. Not since September 11th had the system experienced such a complete shutdown, and the logistics of managing grounded aircraft and stranded passengers were staggering. "We've got over 4,000 flights in the air right now," announced Deputy Administrator Patricia Hayes, her voice tight with stress. "We need to get them all on the ground safely, and then we need to figure out how to restart the entire system once this threat is neutralized." Meanwhile, back at Hartsfield-Jackson, Marcus Williams sat in a small interrogation room, still wearing his security uniform, but now stripped of his badge and radio. The fluorescent light overhead cast harsh shadows on his face as FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh reviewed his file. The irony was not lost on him that just hours earlier, he had been the one ensuring the safety of thousands of travelers. And now, he was being treated as their greatest threat. "Mr. Williams," Agent Walsh began, her tone professional, but not unkind. "We need to understand what happened out there. A witness claims she heard you communicating sensitive information over your radio. Can you explain what she might have observed?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaustion and frustration evident in every line of his body. "Agent Walsh, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I was coordinating with ground crews about standard departure procedures for Flight 447 to Denver. I speak only English and a little high school Spanish. I have never, in my entire career, done anything that could remotely be construed as a security threat." But the witness seemed very certain about what she heard. Agent Walsh pressed. "She was adamant that you were speaking in Arabic and sharing sensitive information." "Then she's either mistaken or she's lying," Marcus replied, his voice hardening with resolve. "And given the magnitude of what's happening right now, I'd suggest you consider very carefully which of those possibilities is more likely." As the first night of the aviation shutdown wore on, the human cost became increasingly apparent. At Denver International Airport, an elderly man named Robert Chen suffered a heart attack while waiting in the interminable lines that had formed as authorities tried to process thousands of stranded passengers. The ambulance that rushed him to the hospital had to navigate through streets clogged with rental cars as travelers desperately sought alternative transportation. In Chicago, a pregnant woman named Maria Santos went into premature labor in the middle of Terminal 2. The stress of the shutdown, combined with her anxiety about missing her scheduled delivery with her trusted obstetrician in Atlanta, had triggered contractions that couldn't be stopped. As paramedics wheeled her through crowds of frustrated travelers, her husband Carlos held her hand and whispered prayers in Spanish. The economic impact was equally devastating. Airlines began calculating losses in the tens of millions of dollars per hour as planes sat idle on tarmacs across the country. Hotel prices near major airports skyrocketed as desperate travelers bid against each other for rooms. Rental car companies ran out of vehicles within hours, leaving thousands of people with no immediate way to reach their destinations. But it was the human stories that truly captured the nation's attention as news crews descended on airports to document the unprecedented crisis. CNN's Anderson Cooper stood in the middle of Atlanta's Terminal A, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of disbelief as he addressed viewers. "What we're witnessing here is nothing short of extraordinary," he reported, gesturing to the sea of stranded travelers behind him. Based on the word of a single witness, the entire American aviation system has been brought to its knees. Families are separated, business deals are collapsing, and medical emergencies are going unaddressed because people simply cannot fly. The pressure on federal authorities to resolve the crisis quickly became enormous. Senator Elizabeth Warren held an emergency press conference from her Washington office, demanding answers about how a single, unverified tip could trigger such a massive response. The American people deserve to know why their government has chosen to prioritize the unsubstantiated claims of one individual over the travel needs and civil liberties of millions of citizens, she declared, her voice ringing with indignation. This is not security. This is security theater taken to its most absurd and destructive extreme. As the second day of the shutdown dawned, Karen Mitchell found herself at the center of a media firestorm she had never anticipated. Reporters had tracked her down to her Roswell home, where she stood on her perfectly manicured lawn, still insisting she had done the right thing. "I saw what I saw," she told a cluster of microphones and cameras. "That man was clearly communicating with terrorists. If people are inconvenienced because I prevented an attack, then so be it. Better safe than sorry." But behind her confident facade, Karen was growing increasingly nervous. She had expected her tip to result in a brief investigation and perhaps the removal of Marcus Williams from his position. She had never imagined it would escalate into a national crisis that was dominating every news cycle and affecting millions of people. Her confidence began to crack further when her neighbor, Janet Peterson, approached her with a concerned expression. "Karen, I saw the news reports about what's happening at the airports. Are you sure about what you think you heard, I mean? This is affecting so many people." "Of course I'm sure," Karen snapped, but there was a defensive edge to her voice that hadn't been there before. "I know what I saw and heard. That man is dangerous, and everyone will thank me when the truth comes out." What Karen didn't know was that federal investigators were already beginning to piece together a very different version of events. Special Agent Walsh had spent hours reviewing security footage from Terminal C, and what she saw raised serious questions about Karen Mitchell's version of events. The footage showed Marcus Williams engaging in routine communications with ground crews, exactly as he had claimed. More importantly, it showed Karen Mitchell lingering near the security checkpoint for nearly an hour before the incident, watching Marcus with what appeared to be deliberate focus. This was not the behavior of someone who had accidentally witnessed suspicious activity. This was someone who had been actively seeking an opportunity to create trouble. Agent Walsh's investigation took a dramatic turn when she decided to conduct a deeper background check on Karen Mitchell herself. What she discovered would prove to be the key to understanding the true motivation behind the false accusation. Karen Mitchell's younger brother, Derek Mitchell, was indeed on the federal no-fly list. He had been placed there 3 years earlier, after being arrested at a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, where he had been caught carrying weapons and making threats against federal officials. The placement on the no-fly list had effectively ended his career as a traveling pharmaceutical sales representative and had caused significant financial hardship for his family. More importantly, Agent Walsh discovered that Derek had been pressuring Karen to help him find a way to get removed from the list. Phone records showed dozens of increasingly desperate calls from Derek to his sister in the weeks leading up to the incident at Hartsfield-Jackson. In their final conversation, recorded just 2 days before Karen's accusation against Marcus Williams, Derek had made his intentions clear. "Karen, you don't understand how this is destroying my life." His voice pleaded through the recorded call. "I can't work. I can't travel to see my kids. I can't even take a vacation. You have to help me find a way to prove that the system is flawed, that they make mistakes. If we could show that they're targeting the wrong people, maybe they'd realize they got me wrong too." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with devastating clarity. Karen Mitchell had not witnessed a terrorist plot. She had orchestrated a false flag operation designed to discredit the federal security apparatus and create chaos that might somehow benefit her brother's situation. The scope of her miscalculation was breathtaking. Agent Walsh shared her findings with her superiors, who immediately began planning for a very different kind of arrest than the one they had initially anticipated. The evidence against Karen Mitchell was overwhelming, and the charges she would face were far more serious than anything her brother had ever confronted. As the second night of the shutdown approached, the pressure to resolve the crisis had reached a breaking point. Airlines were threatening lawsuits against the federal government for lost revenues. International allies were questioning America's ability to manage its own transportation infrastructure. Most importantly, public opinion was turning sharply against the authorities who had shut down the entire system based on a single witness account. It was at this moment that the Department of Homeland Security made the decision to hold an emergency press conference. Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas stepped to the podium at FBI headquarters in Washington, flanked by Director Christopher Wray and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. The assembled media sensed that major developments were about to be announced. "Ladies and gentlemen," Secretary Mayorkas began, his voice grave but controlled. "Over the past 36 hours, our aviation system has been shut down based on what we initially believed to be a credible terrorist threat. I am here today to announce that our investigation has revealed that the threat was not credible. In fact, it was deliberately fabricated." The room erupted as reporters shouted questions, but Mayorkas continued with his prepared statement. "We have determined that the individual who made the initial report knowingly provided false information to federal authorities with the intent to disrupt our transportation system. This person will face federal charges under the anti-terrorism statutes, and we are taking immediate steps to restore normal aviation operations." Director Wray stepped forward to provide additional details. "The individual in question appears to have been motivated by a desire to discredit our security systems in order to benefit a family member who is currently on the federal no-fly list. This was not a case of mistaken identity or confusion. This was a deliberate attempt to weaponize our security protocols against an innocent public servant." The announcement sent shockwaves through the media and the public. Within hours, investigative reporters had identified Karen Mitchell as the source of the false tip, and her comfortable life in suburban Roswell was about to be turned upside down. The federal courthouse in Atlanta had not seen this level of media attention since the Olympic bombing trials of the 1990s. Karen Mitchell, now dressed in an orange jumpsuit and flanked by public defenders, sat at the defendant's table as Judge Patricia Hendricks reviewed the charges against her. The courtroom was packed with reporters, aviation industry representatives, and dozens of travelers whose lives had been disrupted by her actions. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez stood to address the court, his voice carrying the weight of representing not just the federal government, but the millions of people who had been affected by Karen's deception. Your Honor, Rodriguez began, the defendant stands accused of providing false information to federal authorities under circumstances that resulted in one of the most significant disruptions to American transportation infrastructure in our nation's history. Her actions shut down the entire aviation system for 36 hours, stranded millions of travelers, cost airlines and related industries over $2 billion in losses, and diverted critical security resources from their legitimate purposes. He paused to let the magnitude of those numbers sink in before continuing. But perhaps, most importantly, Your Honor, the defendant's actions represented a calculated attempt to destroy the reputation and career of Marcus Williams, a dedicated public servant whose only crime was being a black man in a position of authority that the defendant apparently found threatening. Karen's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Rebecca Mills, stood to offer what seemed like a hopeless counterargument. Your Honor, my client maintains that she believed she witnessed suspicious activity. While her interpretation of events was clearly incorrect, she insists that her motivations were based on genuine security concerns. But Prosecutor Rodriguez was ready with evidence that demolished any claim of good faith. Your Honor, the government will show that the defendant spent nearly an hour observing Mr. Williams before making her accusation. Phone records demonstrate that she was under pressure from her brother to find a way to discredit the federal security system. Most damning of all, security footage shows that at no point did Mr. Williams engage in any of the activities the defendant claimed to have witnessed. The trial proceeded with the methodical precision that characterized federal prosecutions. Witness after witness testified about the chaos and suffering that had resulted from Karen's false accusation. Marcus Williams himself took the stand, his dignity intact despite everything he had endured. I've dedicated my entire adult life to protecting travelers and ensuring their safety, he testified, his voice steady but carrying undertones of deep hurt. To be accused of the very crimes I've spent my career preventing was devastating, not just professionally, but personally. The defendant's actions didn't just disrupt the aviation system, they attacked the very principle that people should be judged by their actions and character, not by their race or position. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from some of the travelers who had been stranded during the shutdown. Maria Santos, who had given birth prematurely in Chicago's airport, testified about the medical complications her daughter had faced as a result of the stress and chaos. My daughter spent 3 weeks in intensive care because of the early labor that was triggered by this crisis, she said, tears streaming down her face. The defendant's lies didn't just inconvenience people. They endangered lives, including the life of my innocent child. When Karen Mitchell finally took the stand in her own defense, her testimony only served to further undermine her case. Under cross-examination, she became defensive and contradictory, ultimately admitting that she had been motivated partly by her brother's situation, but still insisting that she had genuinely believed Marcus Williams posed a threat. I was trying to protect people, she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe I was wrong about what I thought I saw, but I was trying to do the right thing. Prosecutor Rodriguez's cross-examination was devastating in its precision. Ms. Mitchell, you testified that you spent an hour watching Mr. Williams before making your accusation. In all that time, did you see him do anything that actually violated security protocols? Well, he was talking on his radio a lot, Karen replied weakly. And as the chief of security, wouldn't you expect him to be communicating regularly with his staff? I guess so, but Ms. Mitchell, did you at any point during that hour hear Mr. Williams speaking Arabic? The question hung in the air as Karen struggled to maintain her story. Finally, her shoulders sagged in defeat. No, she whispered. I never heard him speaking Arabic. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Hendricks sentenced Karen Mitchell to 15 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay restitution of over $50 million to the airlines and other affected parties. The sentence was among the harshest ever handed down under the federal anti-terrorism statutes for a non-violent offense, reflecting the extraordinary scope of the damage her actions had caused. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, Marcus Williams stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by supporters from across the aviation industry and the civil rights community. The cameras captured his expression of quiet satisfaction as justice was finally served. Today's verdict sends a clear message that false accusations motivated by prejudice will not be tolerated in our society, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd of reporters and supporters. My hope is that this case will serve as a reminder that our security systems work best when they're based on facts and evidence, not on fear and bias. In the months that followed, the Karen Mitchell case became a touchstone for discussions about racial profiling, the weaponization of emergency systems, and the importance of accountability in an age of heightened security concerns. Airlines implemented new protocols to verify threats before triggering system-wide shutdowns, and federal authorities developed more sophisticated methods for rapidly assessing the credibility of security tips. Marcus Williams was not only restored to his position, but was promoted to Regional Security Director, overseeing operations at multiple airports across the Southeast. He used his platform to advocate for better training programs that would help security personnel recognize and counter racial bias in their decision-making processes. The aviation industry, meanwhile, worked to rebuild trust with travelers who had been traumatized by the shutdown. Airlines offered compensation packages to affected passengers, and new customer service protocols were implemented to better handle large-scale disruptions when they inevitably occurred in the future. Karen Mitchell's brother Derek remained on the no-fly list. His situation actually worsened by his sister's actions. The association with her federal terrorism conviction made it impossible for him to appeal his own status, and his career in pharmaceutical sales remained permanently derailed. As for Karen herself, she would spend the next decade and a half in federal prison, her comfortable suburban life replaced by the harsh realities of the correctional system. Her case became a cautionary tale studied in law schools and civil rights organizations, a powerful reminder of how individual prejudice, when weaponized through official channels, could cause damage on a truly national scale. The final chapter of the story was written not in courtrooms or airport terminals, but in the quiet moments when travelers once again moved freely through the aviation system that Karen Mitchell had temporarily brought to its knees. Every successful flight, every family reunion, every business meeting conducted on schedule represented a small victory over the forces of fear and prejudice that she had tried to unleash. In the end, the system had held, justice had prevailed, and Marcus Williams continued to protect the skies, his dedication unmarred by the ordeal he had endured, his faith in the principles of service and integrity stronger than ever.